Well, welcome one and all. I'm going to take you through a little bit of a trip on how to maybe put this paper together. Heidi and I are going to do that for you. And I'm going to show you basically, my approach to doing this, putting this paper together. And it starts pretty much before, COVID-19 starts to become an issue. Where I was just walking through the library one day. It's my local public library. And I happened to see this particular book. It was called Jamgon Kontrul the Great. And I said to myself, well, who is Jamgon Kontrul and why is he the great? This is somebody that I had really never heard of before. And that intrigued me. And I said, well, maybe I should get this book from the library and find out who this guy is. So indeed that's what I did, and I put it aside for several weeks, and then all of a sudden, I thought it might be advantageous to take a look at it as an example of how you might be able to build up a paper from a topic I know nothing about. I don't even know, when I picked it up, I didn't even know where this guy was in the world. But I thought that, being the great, he must have done something pretty important. I mean, we don't use those titles lightly. We use them for Alexander the Great, Frederick the Great, Charlemagne, all right, as Magne is the Great in French. So, I thought, well, who is this guy and why have I never heard of him? And the other thing I think it kind of illustrates, not only that you can start from ground zero in terms of who the person is that you're researching, but also it kind of illustrates that in order to do this paper you have to start with being curious, and curiosity is of the utmost importance. If you don't have curiosity, then you have to kind of find a way for you to be able to create that for yourself, because in the absence of it, it really becomes extremely difficult. And I would say this too, that entertainment is kind of the opposite of what curiosity is. Entertainment dulls curiosity. Curiosity is about something you don't know about, and you have to make a concerted effort to go find some information about. So that's where we're at with Jamgon Kontrul. See, I can barely even say the name even now. So who is this guy, and how does it relate to our paper? Well, first of all, let me tell you a little bit about Buddhism, because he's a central figure in Buddhist life. And for those of you who haven't studied Buddhism, I'll just put this up here and tell you a little bit about the major tenets of Buddhism and the major schools, because they play a big part in his story. Buddhism, as you well know, is something that is the fourth largest religion in the world, and it's something that has a number of different major schools, just like Islam does, just like Christianity, Catholicism, Protestantism, and other offshoots of that. Buddhism has basically three major schools, depending on how you put this together. The first one is the Theravada, and that's generally found in Southeast Asia. And most of the ideas that come from Buddhism there are kind of ideas that are related to doctrinal notions of how one becomes enlightened. The second school, the Mahayana, is one that you find is kind of more like Chinese Buddhism. But that's a little bit different in the respect that in that school of Buddhism you kind of have an intermediary state of the Bodhisattva who is able to achieve nirvana or achieve a nothing state of mind, and as a result you are able to achieve enlightenment. And then thirdly, there's a kind of branch off of the Mahayana that's influenced by Hinduism that's referred to as the Vajrayana, okay, and of that you have then Tibetan Buddhism, because Tibet is very close to the Indian border. And that's where, Jamgon Jamgon Kontrul's story is related because he's a very influential figure in Tibetan Buddhism. Now, most of us know probably only one thing about Tibetan Buddhism, and that is the Dalai Lama. And he is certainly the central figure, but he's not the whole story of what goes on with Tibetan Buddhism. As you can see down below this line, there's 5 different schools of, actually 6 if you count the one that we're going to be looking at closely, of Buddhism and of Tibetan Buddhism. And you have those, the first one is Nyingma, second is Kagyu, Sakya, Gelug, which is the school that the Dalai Lama is associated with and is the most influential one, still today. And then you have a minor sect called Jonang. And then here this guy, Jamgon Kontrul, what he's most famous for is basically starting this 6th, school of Tibetan Buddhism called Rimé, which is a compounding of the first 3 schools, Nyingma, Kagyu, and Sakya, as kind of distinct disciplines which you can mix and match various different doctrines from, and they became this kind of practice of Rimé, or without sect is how it translates from the original language. And those 3, of course, as you can see, kind of stand apart from the Gelug, which is the major religion that comes into form in Tibetan Buddhism in the 17th century, and from which the line of Dalai Lamas, of which we're on the 15th right now, is founded. Okay, so that's a little bit of background in terms of who this guy is and why he's so important. He's essentially, one of the caretakers of Tibetan Buddhism, and the reason he's gotten a lot more attention recently is, of course, because since 1959, when the Chinese come in and basically forced the current Dalai Lama to flee and live in India and take refuge really throughout the world, the communists come in there and talk about religion as the opiate of the people, so they kind of tamp down a lot of the Buddhist practices and teachings. Well, the work of Jamgon Kontrul of kind of trying to collect a lot of these Buddhist teachings back in the 19th century really helped preserve a lot of Buddhist practice and Buddhist doctrine today, because without his work it's very likely that the Chinese would have stamped out a lot of those old Buddhist teachings, old Tibetan Buddhist teachings. So that's a little bit of background on who this person is. Let's talk about specifically how, his story might fit into Gladwell's categories. And for that I have this set of ideas here. I'm basically going to use the four categories. And the first one is the Matthew effect, talk about his parents and his family. Second is 10,000 hours. And then the third one is Advantageous Era of Birth. And then the fourth one is cultural practices. And I'm going to fly through this fairly quickly. So the idea, he has a very interesting background in terms of his birth. His biological father is a Lama within the Bon tradition, which I forgot to mention over here. But if you look at this list of various different schools of Tibetan Buddhism, you'll see up here is the Bon. And the Bon will kind of pre-Buddhist ancestors to all Buddhism in Tibet. So they existed pre-700. They're kind of similar to the way the pagans would be for Christianity. Before our Buddhism rolls into the area, they're the indigenous religion. So his father is a Lama, or a monk, essentially, within that Bon tradition. Now his mother, though, marries another man. So this is a strange kind of lineage where he claims this Lama as his father and who he studied with, and yet he lives with his mother who was married to this artisan. Probably for a number of different reasons that this worked out the way it does. Largely because Lamas are renunciates, people who renounce all kind of material possessions and belongings. So in order to raise a family, you have to kind of have somebody who's going to be a provider. So she marries this guy who's an artisan, who's also a practitioner of the Bon religion, but he's very strict, very stern disciplinarian. And it's kind of important for a couple of different reasons. One is we'll see later, this foster father, whose name is Sonam Pel, okay, right here. He is, like I said, he's very, very, very strict with his son, to the point where, you know, he would beat him, essentially, if he didn't pay attention to his meditations and his prayers and his tasks of memorizing various different sutras and other sayings that were part of religious practice. And then his father would be somebody who would teach him more about the overarching aspects of Buddhism, would teach him who the major gods were, because it's a pantheistic religion, many different gods. So he got really a religious background from his real biological father, you know, a strict kind of, you know, master-apprentice, almost tutelage. What's kind of interesting about that is I think later on what he becomes known for is kind of, you know, if you look at these different schools of Buddhism, they were all kind of at odds with each other, and none of them would really accept the other's teachings. And what Rimé basically does is he consolidates and gives legitimacy to all of them. And so he kind of learns to live with various different masters, if you will. And that's kind of interesting that, you know, his family background with these two fathers would lend itself to that kind of situation. I think he learned to play off two different sets of rules and two different notions of how the world works by having these two different kinds of fathers. So in effect, that kind of gives him an advantage early on that relates to the Matthew effect. Also because his father's a Lama, just like what he essentially becomes known for, it gives him a great amount of insight into, you know, what religious practice is about, the renunciation of the world, scholarly teachings, learning how to memorize various different kinds of scripture, etc., etc. So he certainly has a leg up on everybody else in that regard. In fact, it's kind of interesting. Here's a passage from the book that talks about him when he was a young boy and the nature of his play, so to speak. And it says, and we learn all about this because he wrote extensively about his life later on when he was in his old age. He claims that he cared only to dress up in monk's clothing and make believe that he was a Lama, performing rituals for his playmates. He pretended to give empowerments, make torma, ritual offering cakes, out of dirt, and perform offering ceremonies modeled after smoke offering rituals to local protector deities. I dare say that I did not do any of that when I was, you know, at the age of what we're talking about here, probably about 5 or 6 years old. So he was somebody who was pretty much early on destined for work in this kind of religious manner. So there's that, 10,000 hours. His foster father was merciless in terms of making him learn all of this doctrine. Later on, he goes and he studies at one of the foremost monasteries from the ages of 16 to 19, where he learns all about formal Buddhist practice. And there's a whole chapter in there about the various different scriptures that he learned. I won't even get into all the detail on that because I don't have the time to do it.